My parents left me stranded at a train station to teach me a lesson, laughing. Let's see how he finds his way home. I never came back. I was 13 years old, standing on a freezing concrete platform with nothing but a thin backpack and the sound of the departing train fading into the night. I still remember my mother's laughter, drifting through the open car window, while my father smirked and waved as if abandoning their own son was some harmless family joke. They expected me to panic, cry, and somehow stumble home begging for forgiveness. Instead, the station lights flickered above me. Strangers hurried past without a second glance, and the last train disappeared into the darkness, taking my childhood with it. I waited for hours, convincing myself they would return. They never did. That night, I learned something no child should ever have to learn. The people meant to protect you can become the ones who leave the deepest scars. 20 years later, those same parents stood trembling outside the gates of my mansion, begging to see the son they thought they'd broken. They had no idea they were about to discover the greatest mistake of their lives. Growing up, I was never the child my parents wanted. I was the child they tolerated. Nothing I did was ever enough. If I earned good grades, they asked why I wasn't first. If I stayed quiet, they called me weak. If I defended myself, they said I was disrespectful. Every day felt like an exam designed for me to fail. My father believed fear built character. My mother believed humiliation built obedience. Together, they turned our home into a place where mistakes were remembered far longer than kindness. They laughed at my dreams, mocked my sensitivity, and treated every success as something I owed them rather than something I had earned. That I learned to read people's moods before they spoke. I apologized for things that weren't my fault. I stayed invisible because invisible children attracted fewer storms. At school, teachers saw a polite, hard-working boy. They had no idea that every afternoon, I walked home wondering which version of my parents would be waiting behind the front door. Some evenings were silent. Others were filled with criticism disguised as life lessons. The train station wasn't an isolated act of cruelty. It was simply the first time they pushed their lessons so far that there was no road back. Looking back now, I realize they never underestimated my intelligence. They underestimated my ability to survive without them. And that mistake became the foundation of everything I built afterward. The weeks before they abandoned me were filled with little moments that seemed harmless to everyone else but carved deep marks into me. My father had a habit of looking at me over the top of his newspaper, shaking his head without saying a word. Somehow, that silent disappointment hurt more than yelling ever could. Whenever relatives visited, my mother smiled warmly at them, then casually turned me into the evening's entertainment. She would laugh about how forgetful I was, how timid I seemed, or how I'd never survive on my own. Everyone chuckled politely. I forced a smile, pretending I wasn't listening. If my older cousins made mistakes, they were told they were still learning. When I made one, it became proof that I would never amount to anything. At dinner, conversation stopped whenever I tried to speak. My father would clear his throat, change the subject, or answer a question that no one had asked. Before long, I stopped offering my thoughts altogether. Looking back, I can still picture the exchanged glances between my parents whenever I reached for something beyond their expectations, a new hobby, a bigger dream, a little confidence. They never argued with me directly. They simply smiled at each other, as if sharing a private joke that I wasn't meant to understand. By the time they suggested our family train trip, I mistook their unusual kindness for hope. I didn't realize they had already decided that the final lesson was about to begin. Before we reached the station, I noticed something that didn't feel right. My parents were unusually cheerful. They exchanged quiet smiles whenever they looked at me, the kind adults share when they think a child doesn't understand what's happening. I tried to ignore the feeling in my stomach, convincing myself that maybe this trip was different. Then the train doors closed. I stood on the platform, holding my backpack while my father leaned toward the window and laughed. Let's see how he finds his way home. My mother's smile never faded as the train began to move. She didn't wave goodbye with sadness. She waved as though the entire scene was entertainment. For a few seconds, I ran alongside the train, calling out to them. Then it gathered speed, carrying their laughter farther away, until all I could hear was the steel grinding against the tracks. I stopped running. That was the exact moment something inside me became perfectly still. I wasn't thinking about revenge. I wasn't planning my future. I was simply accepting a truth that could never be undone. If my own parents could leave me behind without a trace of regret, then I owed them nothing. Not my loyalty, not my forgiveness, not even my return. I turned away from the tracks and walked back toward the station building, Not because I knew where to go, but because standing there waiting for them had become pointless. The boy who had arrived believing family meant forever disappeared on that platform. The person who walked away would never spend another day trying to earn love from people who had already decided he wasn't worth keeping. After that night, survival became my only priority. A retired station master noticed I had nowhere to go and contacted a local children's shelter. For the first time in my life, strangers treated me with more kindness than my own family ever had. They didn't ask me to prove my worth. They simply gave me a chance. I learned quickly that anger burns fast, but discipline lasts. While other children dreamed about escaping their past, I focused on building a future that couldn't be taken from me. I studied before sunrise, worked part-time after school, and accepted every scholarship I could earn. Years later, I graduated with a degree in finance and contract law, fields where every promise had to be written, every decision documented, and every consequence understood. I never searched for my parents. I never posted about them or tried to expose them. Silence became my greatest advantage. They believed they had erased me from their lives, while I quietly built a life they couldn't imagine. I founded a small consulting firm that specialized in rescuing struggling family-owned businesses through legal restructuring and financial recovery. One careful decision led to another. Profits became investments. Investments became companies. And companies became lasting wealth. I didn't build my success to make them jealous. I built it so completely that, if they ever came looking for the son they abandoned, they would discover they no longer had the power to define who he had become. 20 years passed before I heard their names again. My assistant placed a thin folder on my desk and quietly said, "There's an elderly couple at the front gate. They insist they're your parents." I looked through the security cameras instead of rushing outside. Time had changed them. My father's shoulders, once so proud, were bent. My mother's confident smile had been replaced by nervous glances toward the iron gates. Surrounding the estate, they clutched a worn envelope, shifting their weight from one foot to the other, as though rehearsing words they should have spoken decades earlier. I didn't keep them waiting out of spite. I simply finished the meeting I was already in. When I finally stepped onto the front terrace, they looked up with hopeful eyes. For a brief moment, I saw recognition flash across their faces, followed immediately by disbelief as they took in the home, the gardens, and the life that existed without them. My father tried to smile. "We've been looking for our son," he said quietly. I nodded once. I know. No anger escaped my voice. No accusations filled the silence. I simply asked the house manager to bring out a small cardboard box. Inside were the only things I had carried from that train station 20 years earlier. The faded backpack, a train ticket, and a photograph of the three of us before they decided to leave me behind. I placed the box between us. "Everything you left that day," I said softly, "is finally being returned." Neither of them reached for the box at first. My mother's hands trembled as she stared at the faded train ticket. The color drained from her face, and tears slipped down her cheeks without a sound. My father, the man who had always believed silence was a sign of strength, couldn't hold my gaze. His eyes remained fixed on the ground, as though the weight of 20 years had finally settled on his shoulders. The house staff watched from a respectful distance. None of them knew the full story, but they understood enough. No one interrupted. No one whispered. The silence said more than sympathy ever could. My father finally spoke. "We thought you'd come home." I shook my head gently. "I did. I just built a different one." Those words seemed to land harder than any accusation. They hadn't lost me because of one cruel afternoon. They had lost me through years of treating love as something that had to be earned. When they walked back toward the gate, they looked smaller than when they had arrived. They weren't leaving with money, forgiveness, or another chance. They were leaving with the only thing no one could take away from them, the truth. Watching them disappear, I felt no victory, only peace. If this story matters, it's because the deepest revenge isn't making someone suffer. It's building a life so full of purpose that the people who underestimated you become nothing more than distant memories, while you finally become the person you were always meant to be. Months passed after that afternoon, and I never heard from my parents again. I didn't block their number or tell anyone to keep them away. I simply chose not to reopen a chapter that had already reached its ending. Some stories don't need another conversation. They need acceptance. Instead, I invested my time where it truly mattered. I expanded my business, funded scholarships for abandoned and neglected children, and quietly supported shelters that gave frightened kids the same chance someone had once given me. Every time a young person walked across a graduation stage because of those programs, it felt like another piece of my own childhood had finally healed. People sometimes asked how I had become successful after such a difficult beginning. They expected a secret formula or a dramatic tale of revenge. The truth was much simpler. The greatest victory wasn't the mansion, the companies, or the wealth. It was waking up every morning without carrying the bitterness that once threatened to define me. My parents spent years trying to teach me that I would never survive without them. Life answered that question far better than I ever could. I built a family from people who chose one another, not from blood alone. My home became a place where no child was afraid to speak, where laughter never came at someone's expense, and where love was never used as a reward. Sometimes I still think about that lonely boy standing on the cold train platform, watching the last carriage disappear into the night. If I could speak to him now, I wouldn't promise that life would be easy. I'd simply tell him to keep walking, because one day, the road that began with abandonment would lead him somewhere his parents never imagined, a place where his past no longer owned him, and his future belonged entirely to himself. The day they left me at that station, they thought they were abandoning their son. In reality, they abandoned their only chance to know the man he would become.